Did you know that the American Civil War resulted in more than 620,000 deaths? That's more than the total U.S. casualties in both world wars combined. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in American history, and its impact is still felt today. The American Civil War, fought between 1861 and 1865, stands as one of the most defining events in the history of the United States. This brutal conflict pitted the northern states, known as the Union, against the southern states, known as the Confederacy. The war was primarily sparked by deep-seated differences over slavery and states' rights, but its consequences extended far beyond those issues. The Civil War not only determined the fate of slavery in America, but also redefined the nation's ideals of liberty and equality. More than 620,000 lives were lost in battles, sieges, and devastating campaigns. Cities were destroyed, economies were shattered, and families were torn apart. Why does this war matter today? Its legacy continues to shape modern America, especially in matters of race, national identity, and regional politics. Understanding the Civil War allows us to grasp the roots of many issues we still face, from civil rights struggles to debates about federal versus state power. This was a conflict that truly set the stage for the future of the United States. The American Civil War didn't start overnight. It was the result of decades of mounting tension and unresolved conflicts between the northern and southern states. The primary causes of these tensions were rooted in three major issues: slavery, states' rights, and economic differences. Slavery. At the heart of the conflict was the issue of slavery. By the mid-19th century, the northern states had largely moved away from slavery, while the southern economy relied heavily on it, particularly in agriculture. The South's vast cotton plantations were dependent on slave labor, and the southern states saw any threat to slavery as a direct attack on their economic survival and social order. The debate became even more heated as the nation expanded westward, with arguments over whether new territories would allow slavery or be free. The 1850s saw a series of political events that only inflamed the situation further. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required Northerners to return escaped slaves to their Southern owners, causing outrage in abolitionist circles. The infamous Dred Scott v. Sanford decision in 1857 declared that African Americans had no rights under the Constitution, further entrenching the divide. But perhaps the biggest flashpoint was the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that exposed the brutal realities of slavery and galvanized public opinion in the North against the institution. States' rights. The second key issue was the question of states' rights versus federal authority. Southern states believed they had the right to govern themselves without interference from the federal government, particularly when it came to issues like slavery. This belief was enshrined in the concept of states' rights, which argued that individual states should have more autonomy to make decisions that best suited their needs. The South feared that the federal government, increasingly controlled by the more populous northern states, would impose laws that would weaken their power. For instance, they saw attempts to limit or abolish slavery as a violation of their states' rights. When Abraham Lincoln, a member of the anti-slavery Republican Party, was elected president in 1860, the southern states felt they had no choice but to secede from the Union. They believed their rights, particularly their right to maintain the institution of slavery, were under direct threat. Economic differences. Beyond slavery and states' rights, the North and South were also divided by their economies. The northern states were rapidly industrializing, building factories, railroads, and cities. Their economy was based on manufacturing, trade, and wage labor. In contrast, the southern economy was almost entirely agrarian, focused on cotton, tobacco, and other cash crops that relied on slave labor. These economic differences created conflicting interests. The North favored high tariffs to protect its growing industries from foreign competition, while the South opposed these tariffs, which made imported goods more expensive. Additionally, Northern industrialists wanted a strong federal government that could build infrastructure, regulate trade, and promote business interests, while the South preferred a weaker federal government to protect its agricultural way of life. The combination of these tensions, slavery, states' rights, and economic differences, set the stage for secession. In 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede, followed by 6 other southern states, which formed the Confederate States of America. The Union, led by President Lincoln, refused to recognize the secession, and soon the country was plunged into civil war. As the American Civil War raged on, several key events, battles, and figures shaped the course of the conflict and ultimately the fate of the nation. These moments and people were crucial in deciding the war's outcome and its long-lasting effects on the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation, one of the most pivotal moments in the Civil War, was President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Issued on January 1, 1863, this executive order declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be set free. Though the proclamation didn't immediately free all slaves, since it didn't apply to border states or areas under Union control, it fundamentally changed the nature of the war. The conflict was no longer just about preserving the Union, it had become a fight to end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation also had important international ramifications. European countries like Britain and France, which had considered supporting the Confederacy due to their reliance on Southern cotton, were now less likely to do so. With the war officially framed as a moral struggle against slavery, it became politically difficult for foreign powers to back the Confederacy. The proclamation also allowed for the recruitment of African American soldiers into the Union Army. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black soldiers had served in the Union forces, playing a crucial role in its eventual victory. The Battle of Gettysburg. Among the many battles fought during the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg stands out as a turning point. Fought from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, it was one of the bloodiest battles of the war, with over 50,000 casualties on both sides. Gettysburg marked the furthest advance of the Confederate Army into Northern Territory, and it was here that General Robert E. Lee's attempt to invade the North was decisively thwarted. The battle ended in a significant Union victory, halting Lee's momentum and forcing his army to retreat back into the South. Gettysburg not only shifted the military balance, but also had a profound psychological impact. The North's morale was boosted, and the South's hope of winning foreign recognition or support dwindled. Just a few months later, in November 1863, President Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, one of the most famous speeches in American history, where he honored the fallen soldiers and reaffirmed the Union's commitment to winning the war and preserving the nation. Key figures. Several individuals stand out as key players in the Civil War, both on the battlefield and in the political arena. Abraham Lincoln, of course, was the Union's guiding figure. His leadership, vision, and unwavering commitment to preserving the Union and abolishing slavery defined the Union cause. He faced immense pressure, both from his own political allies and the public, yet his steady hand through some of the nation's darkest days ultimately kept the country together. On the battlefield, Ulysses S. Grant emerged as the Union's most effective general. After a series of frustrating leadership changes in the Union Army, Grant's relentless strategy of attrition against the Confederate forces proved successful. He understood that the Union's superior numbers and resources could wear down the Confederates, and he wasn't afraid to engage in brutal, costly campaigns to achieve victory. For the Confederacy, General Robert E. Lee became a symbol of Southern military brilliance. Lee's tactical expertise won him several key victories, including the Battle of Chancellorsville. However, his decision to invade the North in the Gettysburg campaign was ultimately his undoing. Despite being outnumbered, Lee's troops put up fierce resistance, but the defeat at Gettysburg marked the beginning of the Confederacy's decline. Another key figure was William Tecumseh Sherman, whose infamous March to the Sea in late 1864 demonstrated the Union's growing dominance. Sherman's strategy of total war involved destroying not just the Confederate Army, but also its economic resources. His troops marched from Atlanta to Savannah, leaving a path of destruction in their wake, crippling the South's ability to wage war. This psychological blow further demoralized the Confederacy and hastened its collapse. The fall of the Confederacy. By early 1865, it was clear that the Confederacy was on its last legs. The Union had captured major Southern cities like Atlanta, and General Grant's army had laid siege to Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. In April 1865, with his forces dwindling and supplies running out, General Lee was forced to surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. However, the end of the Civil War did not mean the end of the challenges for the United States. The post-war period, known as Reconstruction, would present its own set of difficulties as the nation struggled to rebuild and integrate the southern states back into the Union, while also ensuring rights and protections for newly freed African Americans. The climax of the American Civil War came in April 1865 when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. This event marked the effective end of the Civil War and the collapse of the Confederacy. By this time, the Confederate Army was in dire straits. After 4 long years of war, the South's resources had been drained, its cities devastated, and its people exhausted. Lee's forces had been steadily pushed back by Grant's relentless campaign, and after a long siege at Petersburg, the Union Army broke through the Confederate defenses, forcing Lee to abandon the Confederate capital, Richmond. With his army weakened and on the verge of starvation, Lee attempted to escape to the mountains, hoping to continue the fight through guerrilla warfare. But Grant's forces pursued him closely, and by April 9, 1865, it was clear that further resistance was futile. Lee, ever the honorable leader, chose to surrender rather than prolong the bloodshed. The meeting between Lee and Grant at Appomattox Courthouse was both somber and respectful. Grant, who had great admiration for Lee as a military leader, offered generous terms of surrender. He allowed Lee's men to return home with their horses so they could use them for spring planting, and he ensured that none of the Confederate soldiers would be tried for treason. This act of leniency helped pave the way for national reconciliation. Lee's surrender at Appomattox was more than just a military defeat. It signaled the collapse of the Confederacy. Within weeks, other Confederate armies followed suit, and the remaining Confederate government officials were either captured or fled. Although some fighting continued in isolated areas, the surrender at Appomattox effectively marked the end of the Civil War. The implications of the surrender. The surrender at Appomattox not only ended the bloodiest conflict in American history, but it also began the difficult process of healing a divided nation. The Union was preserved, but the war left deep scars. Over 620,000 soldiers had lost their lives, millions more were wounded, and entire regions of the country had been ravaged by the fighting. Perhaps the most significant outcome of the war was the abolition of slavery. The 13th Amendment, passed by Congress in 1865, formally ended slavery throughout the United States. The end of slavery was a monumental victory for human rights, but it also raised new challenges for the country as it faced the question of how to integrate millions of newly freed African Americans into American society. The surrender at Appomattox also had long-lasting political and cultural impacts. It marked the end of the Confederacy and the Southern states' fight for independence. But it didn't resolve all the underlying issues that had led to the war, particularly the question of race. The Reconstruction era that followed was fraught with challenges as the nation attempted to rebuild the South, integrate freed slaves, and redefine the balance of power between the federal government and the states. Although Lee's surrender was the end of the Civil War, it was only the beginning of the next chapter in American history. The country had to grapple with the complex legacy of the war, which still resonates today in discussions about race, civil rights, and the role of government in American life. The American Civil War was a defining moment in the nation's history, one that reshaped the country politically, socially, and economically. The war ended the institution of slavery, but it left deep divisions that would take decades, if not centuries, to heal. The Union was preserved, but the scars of the conflict lingered. The post-war era of Reconstruction brought both hope and struggle. As the nation worked to rebuild the South and integrate millions of newly freed African Americans, new challenges emerged around civil rights and racial equality, issues that continue to shape the country today. Politically, the war solidified the power of the federal government over the states, and it laid the groundwork for the modern United States. Economically, the war spurred industrial growth in the North, while leaving the Southern economy in ruins. Ultimately, the Civil War was not just a battle over territory or political ideals. It was a fight for the soul of the nation, a fight that has left an enduring legacy. Its lessons remain crucial in understanding the ongoing challenges and triumphs of American democracy. Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to check out our other videos on American history for more in-depth content. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out.